This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, April 24th, 2026. The Arctic has become an increasingly important focus of North American defense planning due to its geographic role as the shortest route for a range of modern missile systems, and its growing relevance to surveillance, maritime activity, and early warning infrastructure. At the same time, evolving threats are placing pressure on existing continental defense arrangements, particularly the Canada-US bilateral NORAD framework, to operate across multiple domains and integrate air, maritime space, and cyber awareness more effectively. These discussions also intersect with broader debates on integrated air and missile defense, including layered systems approaches often associated with concepts such as the Golden Dome, and how allied architectures manage warning and defeat functions across shared networks. Recent policy developments and spending announcements have centered on expanding Arctic infrastructure, improving situational awareness, and addressing long-standing gaps in communications, logistics, and operational reach across northern Canada. On today's episode of the Expert Series, Andrea Charron, director at the University of Manitoba's Centre for Defense and Security Studies, examines how these dynamics are reshaping assumptions about Arctic security and what they may imply for the future of continental defense cooperation. This is the Expert Series. Andrea, thanks so much for taking time to come on the podcast today.
My pleasure.
So last month, around March 12th, Prime Minister Carney announced an ambitious new plan to quote-unquote defend, build, and transform the North. I'll ask you a few questions later on, Andrea, to flesh out what this plan is, but could you explain to our audience what exactly this plan entails and what its significance is?
Well, I'll start with the significance. I think this is generational investment in defending Canada. And much of that money is going to be in the Arctic because the front line of defense for Canada and the United States has been the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, and they need more resources placed in the Arctic so that they can continue to warn and defeat air threats and warn of any maritime threats coming at North America.
Andrea, maybe, to back up a moment, this podcast attracts the attention of both practitioners, policymakers, but also a general audience. Maybe for an audience or someone who's tuning in for the first time, you could elaborate on some of these maritime or aerial threats and maybe more generally, the most consequential threats to the Arctic right now.
Mm-hmm. So the reason why the Arctic Ocean is getting so much attention is because it is in a very strategic location. It is the smallest ocean, and therefore, if you can launch missiles over the Arctic, or you can have maritime platforms using the Arctic, you can hit just about any target in the world. And traditionally, especially for North America, the most concerning military threat has been air threats through the Arctic. So think about during the Cold War, we had the Soviet Bear bombers. Increasingly, we now have intercontinental ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, cruise missiles, sub-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles. So a variety of missiles that can use the Arctic as the fastest avenue of approach. And then if they're coming from Russia or potentially China, increasingly North Korea and, potentially Iran, they can hit North American targets from their homeland. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of attention to the Arctic, because if you can place sensors, Arctic over the horizon radar, satellite systems, maritime-based sensors, the further north we can see into the Arctic and beyond, the more options we have to deter any such attack. Now, when it comes to maritime threats, that has been traditionally the concern for Norway, the European Arctic, using what we call the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, the sort of transit way between the North Atlantic and the Arctic. And the Russian fleet, especially their nuclear capable subs, would prowl in that area so that they can hold North America to risk. The whole idea for especially the peer competitor that is China and the disruptor that is Russia, if they can hold to risk military assets in North America because they have a missile that can hit them, or they've got subs off the coast that can deter any action, then they can hold us to risk, and then North America cannot come to the aid of allies in Europe and elsewhere.
Now, Andrea, I'd like to speak to something that's been relatively topical for the past few months. And, this is not to say that the president behaved diplomatically or even morally acceptably. This is not to comment on his conduct in any sense, but could some of the threats you've just described and challenges explain the rationale behind President Trump and the U.S. administration's recent rhetoric around acquiring Greenland and the importance of doing so? Where does Greenland maybe fit into all of this?
Mm-hmm. So to put it in terms that maybe President Trump would appreciate, Greenland has always been strategic real estate. And that's again because it provides the United States with advanced warning of any potential incoming missiles that might fly over Greenland. And if you can have missile detection radar in Greenland, then it gives the United States and Canada more time and space to react. It's what we call deterrence by denial. And everybody is racing to be able to see in all domains and as far away from their homelands as possible so that they can potentially target what we call the archers rather than the arrows. So you want to go after, especially for intercontinental ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles, you want to go after the launch platforms as opposed to the missiles themselves, because they become more and more difficult to defeat once they are launched. And so the United States has had an agreement, a longstanding agreement with Denmark, with the permission of Greenland, to have a base in what we call Bidefik space base in the northern half of Greenland. And there they have a missile detection radar that gives the United States that advanced warning. And it seems that President Trump wants to own things as opposed to putting in the time, resources, and energy to nurture allied relationships, because right now that 1951 agreement is very flexible and could potentially allow for more U.S. basing in Greenland, but he seems to understand only ownership, not relationships. And so this is the recurring problem that all allies are having dealing with this particular U.S. administration.
You have to forgive me, Andrea. I'm straying a bit from our initial set of questions here, which I promise we'll get back to in a moment. I did want to follow up on the Greenland matter. I've had your good colleague, the great Dr. James Ferguson, on the podcast many times, and we've spoken about Greenland and Greenland's role in Arctic security. Do you see any potential for Greenland to formally join something like NORAD, or do you see our cooperation with Greenland as being somewhat separate from that, the binational cooperation there?
Mm-hmm. So Jim and I wrote a book called NORAD in Perpetuity and Beyond. And in there, we suggested that what we really need is a North American Defense Command. Really, it should be all singing, all dancing, in that it should have more than 1.5 domains as part of its mandate set. But we've often said that Greenland really is, from a geographic position, a North American state. And so I would love to see one day a trinational NORAD. And really, we should be thinking in terms of a quadranational NORAD that includes not only Greenland, but Mexico, because of the air threats that we are all facing. And the advantage of this binational agreement that is NORAD, the NORAD commander is mandated to think about the defense of North America, not just Canada and not just the United States. And so what we have done is sort of erased jurisdictional seams that normally adversaries love to exploit. And so if we can integrate our air and missile sensor systems, we are going to be better defended than if we are trying to do this all nationally. So yes, I would love to see in a future, and of course with the permission of Greenlanders and Denmark and potentially Mexico, that we think about NORAD expanding its partnership. The other thing is that we need NORAD and future larger NORAD to really work in a more integrated fashion with NATO and with other partners so that we take away those artificial seams which adversaries really like to exploit. That's why, for example, Russia likes to dominate the GIUK gap because it falls between different combatant commands. It falls between NORAD and NATO. And so the thinking is always that when you have a seam, it's not going to be as well defended as if you're operating inside a command area.
Thank you for that, Andrea. Maybe we can now revert back to that tranche of investments that were announced and what's within them. But just before we get into some of those specifics, I wanted to bring something to your attention that was in the beginning of a statement that Prime Minister Carney released while he was in Northwest Territories, announcing the investments. And one line says, "The assumptions that shaped decades of Canadian defense and security are being upended." Specifically pertaining to the Arctic, I'm wondering, you've mentioned emerging technologies and threats from China and Russia to the Arctic, but I'm wondering if you can unpack some of those prior assumptions we had and maybe, again, for a lay audience, discuss why those assumptions we had are changing now.
Well, I think some of the assumptions is that a threat only appears in one domain. And so long as we have a command like NORAD focusing on that domain, for example, the air domain, we will be fully defended. But that's no longer the case. We're also seeing that safety and security issues can meld into becoming military threats. And military threats can also have safety and security aspects to it as well. So this is why you are now seeing all militaries around the world looking for better situational awareness and what they call joint all-domain command and control, so that you are aware of activity in, for example, the Arctic in all the different domains. And then you have more options. Perhaps this actually isn't a military problem. Perhaps this is a police or a criminal problem, in which case we can send, the right actors to deal with it. Perhaps we need to recall an ambassador and send a strongly worded letter. Perhaps we actually have to scramble interceptors. But the idea is that we can no longer afford to be blind in 40% of our landmass, which is what the Arctic makes up. And we've got to be able to see what's happening so we have greater situational awareness, because there are environmental problems that could exacerbate ability of Canada to be able to respond. This will have impacts on the rights holders who are in the Arctic. So the more information we have, and from more domains, without drinking from a fire hose. That's going to be the other challenge is making sure that we can separate what are the real concerns from just noise. But then hopefully we have a better, more integrated response that's the right response, and that we are not, for example, launching Sidewinder missiles to deal with hobby balloons that are in the Arctic.
Andrea, last summer in August, I believe you wrote an article for us, Golden Dome in Canada, the New Age of Integrated Air and Missile Defense. Asking this now because I think it aligns a bit with your previous response here. Now, do you see Canada joining something like a Golden Dome configuration if that ever comes to fruition, or do you think Canada independently has the potential to work on a more integrated air and missile defense for its portion of the continent?
Mm-hmm. I think it's going to have to be both, but I want to just unpack the idea of Golden Dome as it is often portrayed by the Trump administration as being this exquisite system with satellite and space-based capabilities that can defend every square inch of the United States is never going to come to pass. Instead, it's going to be a system of systems that are about protecting what we call the defended asset list. So that's the critical civilian infrastructure and critical defense infrastructure that absolutely must be protected for a fight to continue. So it's not every square inch of the United States. NORAD right now has the mandate to warn of any incoming missile, including intercontinental ballistic missiles. What NORAD does not have is the defeat mandate. And in June, Minister McGuinty sort of put aside that no to Canada participating in a U.S. ground-based mid-course system. So this opens the door to conversations. If we hearken back to what I said earlier about scenes and jurisdictions that adversaries can exploit, we really want to have integrated air and missile defense that is a combination of a Golden Dome system for the United States with some nationally based systems for Canada, but that they can both contribute to the warning and potential defeat of missile systems, so that we leverage the fact that we are allies and can share information not only between Canada and the United States, but also between increasingly the NATO integrated air and missile defense systems, which again are going to be a combination of both national and sort of allied systems working together.
Andrew, just from some of my discussions with experts on this podcast and some of my readings, it seems like there tends to be a belief that no matter what happens at the political level in the United States, Canada and the U.S. have a vested interest in working on continental defense together. So despite President Trump making remarks about annexation earlier in the year, despite some of the dramas now over the acquisition of the F-35, is that a view that you yourself hold too, or do you have a different opinion?
I think the United States and Canada, because of propinquity, they are neighbors. We share energy grids together. We share water supplies. We have familial connections. We are so integrated from a supply chain perspective. It would really be unthinkable for us to try and sever all of those connections. Despite, as you say, the political rhetoric right now, NORAD, for example, which has U.S. and Canadian personnel, still continues to work as it should. This sorority and fraternity of the uniform, as Joel Sokolsky calls it, means that they are trained military professionals that get on with the business of defending North America. And I think, Canada and the United States have a history of highs and lows. We are, in a low right now, but as long as cooler heads prevail and political rhetoric, for example, does not invoke things like the cancellation clause that is available in the binational NORAD agreement, then I think we will carry on. From a functional perspective, it makes sense for Canada and the US, and I would argue Greenland and even Mexico, to work together to defend our homelands together, because that gives us deterrence by denial. And it means that adversaries can't select one of us as a potential weak link to then hold the others to risk.
Well, thank you for that, Andrea. And back to the initial reason for us getting together for this podcast, Prime Minister Carney's announcement about $35 billion to expand defense capabilities and infrastructure in Canada's Arctic. So as a primer for our audience, this included upgrades to military bases, new operational hubs, improved airports, construction projects. Could you unpack where the money in this investment is going and what significance that money has for some of the projects I just discussed?
Yeah, so it really is, as I mentioned, generational investment in many of these forward operating locations and deployed operating bases. We have always had, but they are badly under-resourced. So the bulk of the money is going to what's called the NORAD Northern Basing Infrastructure Projects. And that's for Inuvik, Yellowknife, Iqaluit, which we call the forward operating locations, and Goose Bay, which is the deployed operating base, and they are all essential for NORAD operations. You're going to have 50 to 60 sub-projects to build things like multi-platform hangars and operational facilities and some multi-user facilities. So pilots, for example, don't have to sleep on a hangar floor beside their interceptor. Some dining and accommodations, munition storage, fuel storage. One of the big concerns is that when NORAD has to scramble the jets, and let's say they land in Inuvik, the fuel for the jets often takes away from the fuel for the community. And we never want to be in that situation. And so having fuel storage and airfield and aircraft equipment storage, there's also going to be some airfield upgrades, especially for the Inuvik runway. And of course, information management and IT upgrades. So that's where a lot of the bulk of the information is. I want to caution everybody, this does not mean that we're going to have large standing armies at these locations. This is really allowing NORAD to finally have some of the resources that they have long needed. And in several cases, these are going to be multi-purpose, multi-use, which could have some benefits to the communities in which they're located. We're also going to have what we call operational support hubs, northern operational support hubs, which will be in Whitehorse and Resolute, and northern operational support nodes. They'll be much smaller, Cambridge Bay and Rankin Inlet. These, again, are going to be largely some dining and accommodations and storage facilities. One of the problems we have with now having Operation Nanook exercises happening for 10 of the 12 months of the year, we're having to fly up all of the equipment every time. And it would be great if we could pre-position some of this equipment. It's also going to benefit other government departments like the Coast Guard, the RCMP, to have, for example, search and rescue equipment pre-positioned in these locations. and to allow for surge capacity of personnel when needed. And again, it doesn't have to be just military, it can be other government departments, so that they again are not taking away from the housing shortage that is in many of these communities. Now, I think the government of Canada has to be really careful that they articulate exactly what the funding can and cannot provide. So I still have concerns about, clean drinking water in many of the communities, sewer upgrades that are badly needed. What do we do with all the increased garbage? We can't continue to just burn it. And the D&D monies can pay for example, a multi-platform hangar, but it's not in the business of hiring more nurses and building hospitals and trying to find more teachers. So the government of Canada needs to be very careful and clear about what the money can and cannot do. And what I really don't want to see is beautiful, bespoke military capabilities that do nothing to help communities with these long-standing infrastructure under development that is they desperately need to they really should be on the same footing as the South, but because of the eye-watering cost of doing any sort of investment in building in the North, they have always been under-resourced, and that really needs to change.
Andrea, those are great insights for our audience. I think, maybe when the average person thinks about Arctic defense and security, they might think of NORAD modernization, which is obviously a part of that, or jets, big capabilities. But you are right in pointing it out that so much of it is about infrastructure, economic security, and it has to be people focused as well. So I think that's a very excellent point. On another point of semantics, I suppose you could say, when one watches the news or when one reads articles, it seems to be sometimes that the phrases sovereignty and security in the Arctic are used interchangeably or swapped out depending on the context. Could you maybe talk about what people mean when they say Arctic security and sovereignty, and maybe explain those terms a bit more?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's one of the problems, that there haven't been clear definitions. And so sovereignty, security are used interchangeably, and they have insert your concern here without me having to articulate them, which means I never really have to come up with a clear answer for how to deal with them. So, for example, when governments say we are investing in these forward operating locations for our sovereignty, what they really are saying is, listen, our major concern right now is potential territorial incursions, and probably from the air domain. And so by investing in these forward operating locations, we're going to be able to know that these incursions may be happening, even deter them from happening from the first place, and defeat them if necessary. That's the kind of language I would like to see the government use, is to be very clear about what exactly is the threat, rather than wrapping it up in this, we are protecting our sovereignty, because it means something different for everyone. And of course, the rights holders have sovereignty in the North. And when we use sovereignty without specifying what it is we're talking about, it undervalues their sovereignty and the real need for them to be at the tables for pre and prior informed consent about what happens in their land. And so I would, rather than using terms like security and sovereignty, because they're often conflated, is try and be as clear as possible about what is the concern. Is it a territorial incursion? Is it a concern that we're having foreign interference? That, for example, we have Chinese vessels that say they're coming to the North to do scientific research, but it turns out they're actually trying to collect information that they can potentially use against us. Are we concerned that we cannot see everything that's going on. And so we're concerned there's possibility someone or something could slip into Canada via the north that we don't see. That's a situational awareness and domain awareness problem. Then we know, okay, well, what do we need to fix that? If we constantly talk about our sovereignty is threatened, it really doesn't orient anyone to thinking about, well, what is missing? What is the threat? How can we deal with this?
Andrea, we'll wrap up very soon here, but I think our audience would be interested in knowing, if they don't already, that yourself, along with James Ferguson and Chris Morrison, recently penned an excellent threat assessment paper for the CDA Institute called Action Reaction, the North American Threat Environment, NORAD, and Canada's Continental Defense Response. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind taking a few moments just to speak about your recent article.
Well, this was done with our visiting defense fellow, Colonel Chris Morrison, who spent a year with Jim and I and students here at the University of Manitoba to really sort of unpack what is this thing called continental defense versus NORAD. And the concern we've always had is that NORAD is easily undervalued and therefore can be marginalized. And so really what this paper tries to do is point to how vital NORAD is for not only Canada, but for the United States. Where are the areas where we see they could have difficulty in the future? There's been a long-standing concern that U.S. NORTHCOM, which is the command to deal with continental U.S. and Canada and Mexico from a U.S. perspective, is such a big behemoth that it will overtake, eclipse, forget that NORAD is in fact a separate command with a very different mandate. And so pointing out that we need to pay attention to that, and that Canada, of course, is far more aware of the conditions of the binational agreement, more so than perhaps the United States. And so if we want to make sure that NORAD celebrates another 70 plus years in 2028, then we need to value it, resource it, understand it, and be clear-eyed about the future potential challenges.
That's Action Reaction, our latest threat assessment, and I do encourage all of our listeners to give it a read because it really is an excellent piece. Andrea, this has been a great conversation. We initially met up to speak about those recent defense investments in the Arctic. We ended up having a much broader conversation, and I'm grateful for your time and grateful that you would stick around and speak with me about topics beyond what we initially agreed to. To close out the episode, I wanted to ask you if you had any final thoughts about anything we discussed.
I think, and maybe this is the pessimist in me, but we have eye-watering amounts of money promised. We have authorities to spend this money. We need to make sure that we do it efficiently, strategically. But the concern I always have is that other challenges, other issues are going to divert attention from many of these NORAD-specific projects, but they remain the number one priority for both the U.S. and Canada, signed off by both President Trump and President Biden. Many of them are essential to Canada having better domain awareness, especially in the Arctic. And so we need to make sure that these projects come along as quickly as possible, and that every opportunity is given to see how they can be multi-purpose, multi-use, and to keep the rights holders fully informed, and give them advantages to being able to assist in these projects where possible.
Andrea Charron, thank you so much for your time and for coming on the podcast once again. And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Friday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.